Every once in a while, DC introduces a new villain in one of their comics, and this guy turns out to be one of the greatest villains that any of us have ever seen. So this is Batman and Robin, and this continues on from the previous story that we did. However, if you didn't see that, rest assured, all will be explained over the course of this, so you don't have to worry about getting caught up. So we get a description of this guy, right? 2nd degree burns, 3rd degree burns, shrapnel wounds to the back and the shoulder, a concussion, vertigo, burned retinas, lacerated right quadriceps, lacerated hamstring, lacerated right Achilles tendon. And so it's this doctor who's running over all of this, and he says, we do our best with what we've got here, but this guy needs a real hospital, and he definitely cannot be in solitary in his condition. But that's where one of the cops tells him, that's not up to you. Right? You did your job. Now go back to the infirmary where people give a crap about your opinion. And then the cops start talking amongst themselves, right? And one of them asks the question, did Penguin give the order yet? Right? And this guy says, Polypool is supposed to call. Polypool basically being the Penguin's #1 guy. Right? And he says, it'll be tonight. I guarantee it. But this whole conversation is being listened to by the Quiet Man. And so these guys continue on. All the families are talking about what the Quiet Man did to Penguin's crew. Penguin wants to make an example. For now, he just wants us sitting on the door. Nobody in or out. Now, of course, Batman and Robin show up here. Keeping in mind, this is Damian Wayne, the son of Batman. And that's where Bruce addresses the Quiet Man directly. And he says, Cyrus Mercer, resident of Mount Sinai, Pennsylvania, home of the Riverborn Church, Army veteran of 6 years, a Bronze Star recipient. As you were about to be released from prison, you received a note with no return address saying that your son's murderer had been set free. Then a second note saying Two-Face and Penguin were hiding him. Then a third, giving the ventriloquist location. You were used, Mercer. Scarface wrote those notes. Scarface tricked the doctors, murdered his handler, used you to weaken his rivals. Even the ventriloquist didn't know. While you tried to kill your son's killer, he used you to put himself back in the game. Now, this is the important distinction here, right? Two-Face, Penguin, Scarface, even these guys are scared of the Quiet Man, because at that point, you jump over to Polypool, right, and to Penguin. And Polly just says, ventriloquist is dead, boss. Batman got Quiet Man out, but he's in Blackgate. Problem solved. Now, one of the things to remember is that in issues 27 and 28, but specifically in issue number 28, we ended up learning that where basically Wesker, the human who controls Scarface, if you're unfamiliar with the character, that he was in the care of a woman named Blair, and that Blair was basically Batman's contact. The idea was that Wesker had been released from prison under the idea that he was now sane, no longer tied to the Scarface personality at all. And Blair would just kind of make Batman aware of what was going on. But when everything started going sideways, right, when you had Wesker who made his attempt to take out Scarface and the ventriloquist, we ended up learning Blair had been dead for weeks, and that Blair was never the one talking to Batman, that it was actually the ventriloquist. It was Wesker who was masking his voice and tricking Batman into believing that Blair was real. We learned that at the end of issue number 28, when he's running down the road with Blair, and there's just like a dude sitting on steps who sees it, and then comments on the fact that it's just some crazy old guy talking to himself, right? So she was never there. It was always him. But as this continues on, Polypool says, right, it's still good, right, boss? Our guys are in there. Our guards are in there. Quiet Man is one guy with no crew. But that's what the Penguin says, right? That's fine, Polly. These circumstances are acceptable. And he says, I'm headed to this Sacred Heart fundraiser. They'd better remember whose turf they're on, and that I expect to get my beak wet. By the time I get back, the Quiet Man will have tragically killed himself. Understood. And Polly just says, sure thing, boss. Don't even worry about it. And so that's where they kind of start talking amongst themselves, right? Polly and the other henchmen, where they're basically taking up residence in Tiger Shark's old base of operations. And so they kind of talk about this for a second, right? That one of them asks, right, what did Penguin say? And Polly just says, you know, he's happy as long as Quiet Man's dead tonight. Do you think your people can handle that? That this guy says, are you serious, right? There's half a dozen of our guys on shift tonight. He'll be dead in an hour if you want. That's where this voice comes out of nowhere and says, well, that's good news. And just opens fire on everyone and takes out every single one of these guys, only for us to find out it's Scarface, right? The whole time he's taunting everybody, right? Making fun of everybody, and he doesn't really kill every single person. Some of them survive, and that's where he says, right, do you mooks know who I am? And of course, they recognize him, and he says, some of you used to be Tiger Shark's guys. Then you worked for Penguin and Mr. Swiss Cheese here. Now, you work for me. And so that's where Scarface takes out a couple more guys, and then you switch back to Quiet Man. And Batman's continuing to talk to him, and he says, I've pieced together why you were in Gotham the night of the warehouse massacre. You'd found a fortune in stolen treasure in the mountains and arranged to sell it to Falcone. But someone on Falcone's crew sold that information to the other families. The exchange was ambushed. Falcone's money was stolen. Your truck full of silver was stolen. Men were shot to death, and you were left to take the fall. There's only one thing that I don't understand. You have one son on record listed as deceased. You clearly blame Scarface, but no child was found at the scene. And so that's where Damian asks, what happened to your son, Mercer? And Quiet Man just says, he was in the truck. And so that's where he gives us this backstory. And this is what makes him so terrifying, is he says, my army days were over. I was just a driver, piecing together a living. An old army buddy was on Falcone's crew, and he got me work driving shipments in and out of Canada. It was easy. Nothing bad ever happened. And I took my boy Alvin along sometimes. When we were home, Alvin and I went hunting together for a little while. We were hunting when Alvin found an old mine shaft, half fallen in. There were these big rotted crates full of old silver down there. It took us days to haul it out. Some of it is still down there. Now, I told Falcone about the silver, and he said that he'd buy it off of me, set me and the boy up for life. The handoff was supposed to be easy, so Alvin came along. Scarface's crew held us up, probably a dozen guys, plus Scarface himself. He was shooting all directions like a maniac, not even aiming at anybody. Alvin was in the cab of the truck, and he says, I had shot an awful lot of men in war, and I know what it looks like when a man dies. And as soon as Alvin got hit, I knew he was gone. And he says, I was hit pretty bad too. One of Falcone's guys got in my truck and drove it out of there with Alvin and the silver still inside. Nobody ever saw my boy, the truck, or that driver again. And he says, that's all I know to tell you. Now Alvin's name is on an empty grave behind the church that we used to pray in. And so Batman, in hearing all of this, he says, yet you came back here to kill more people. And that's where Quiet Man just says, what do you know about any of it, right? You risk this boy's life every night. What do you know about what losing a family does to a man? Now, Bruce can't reveal his own history here, right? But we know he knows exactly what that does to a man. And so he kind of glosses over it and just says, because you came here looking for revenge. The monster who killed your son is loose again. That is what I know about it. And so at that point, you switch to Damian and Bruce taking off. But Damian actually lets Batman have it here. He doesn't kind of just blindly go along with Bruce. Like, you know what, you're right, Batman. You know, we got to put an end to this guy. No. And it's one of the best things about Damian, right? Because Batman initially chimes in on all of this, and he says, Blair's corpse was weeks old. I've been speaking to the ventriloquist this entire time. Wesker was off the board. Now, because of this revenge-obsessed Quiet Man, we have to, and then he gets cut off by Damian. And Damian just says, you misunderstand him, father. But the response of Bruce, he's a murderer. There's nothing to understand. But Damian says, yes, he has murdered mob soldiers who tried to kill him. But the ventriloquist is the only one he's after. But Bruce cuts him off, right? And he says, he's everything we fight against. No better than Joker or Two-Face. And so that's where ultimately Batman stops the car. And where Damian asks, right, what's wrong? Why have you stopped? Bruce says, so that you can say what you want to say. And Damian unloads, and it's amazing to see. And honestly, I think it shows the maturity of Damian as a character in DC Comics, because he says, I cannot tell if you believe what you say about Mercer or if you're testing me. And Batman asks, right, why would I be testing you? And Damian says, because Mercer is us. Right? Can you really not see that? What if Crime Alley had happened to someone else? Someone without the mind or resources to learn every language and martial art, or the means to engineer jets and batarangs and grappling hooks? What if you had been a poor man from the mountains with only a car and a rifle? Mercer was alone. He had no way to know people like Atticus, Bligh, Henry Descartes, and even Takibi Karigi even exist. His obsession with revenge has doomed him and others. In that, you are right. But you are not so different. If not for Robin, I would have been far worse. And knowing that, I find it of note that you hate him so much. Because in a lot of ways, it's Damian saying, you hate him because you hate yourself. But to the point of Damian Wayne saying, like, what if it had been anybody else, somebody poor without your resources? There's a fantastic story called Batman War on Crime that focuses on that. We've covered it. It's a beautiful story, and arguably the greatest Batman story ever told. That is essentially the exact same thing that Bruce experienced, except this time it's a shooting that takes place in, I think, a corner store, and it involves a young black kid named Marcus. And because he doesn't have the resources of Bruce Wayne, he falls down into a life of crime. And it's only at the very end of the story, when Bruce confronts him in a warehouse in the midst of a robbery, that he takes the gun from Marcus. And in what's probably the most beautiful moment in a Batman comic, he says, "Guns took both of our parents. Do not let it be the thing that takes you," or something to that effect. But it's phenomenal, right? It's just this phenomenal moment. But it goes towards this idea that there are people out there that experience the same thing Batman has experienced every day of the week, whether it's in Gotham City or not. What separates Batman from all those other people are the resources he has at his disposal, which gave him the ability to go on and become Batman and to fight crime and avenge the deaths of his parents. But that's the point that Damian is making. Mercer is us. He's just like us, right? It's simply just the fact that he doesn't have your resources. And so in the midst of this entire conversation, Batman pulls Damian aside, right, and just says, "You're pretty brave, aren't you?" And he says, "We will talk about Mercer more, but right now, we need to find Scarface before he kills again. Use what you've learned. Where do we look?" And that's where Damian just says, we examine what Wesker wants, except that is the wrong question. What matters is what Scarface wants, because Mercer will find Scarface. So finding Scarface will inevitably lead to us finding Mercer again, once he makes his move. And that's where Batman says, correct. After Scarface tricked Dr. Meridian into freeing him, what was his first move, right? It's a teachable moment, because Damian says he sent notes to Mercer in prison. He's out. Two-Face and Penguin nowhere. Do not let them get away with it. And Batman asks, that was a lie. He sent Mercer after his old rivals. Why? And Damian says Two-Face and Penguin hold turf that Scarface once held. He wants to retake his place at the top of the Gotham mob. And so Batman just says, history has shown Scarface to be over-aggressive. He will not play chess if he can flip the board. So, try to kill Penguin or a public show of force. And Damian says, or both. He'll hit Penguin at the Sacred Heart Valentine's Day fundraiser. Take out the guy that he wants to get rid of, while at the same time showing everyone he's not to be trifled with. And that's when you switch to the Quiet Man and what makes him so dope. Because in that moment, you pick up with this conversation, right? These guards who were outside the door. Polypool's dead. Are you sure, man? Right? This one guy says, just talk to Sykes. He was behind the bar, heard the whole thing, said Scarface killed almost everybody. The other guy says, this is not what I signed up for, man. Guy is crazy, even for Gotham. And where they go back and forth, they ultimately end up hearing that Mercer has seemingly escaped, where one of the cuffs have fallen off his arm and he ripped off a pipe. Because when these guys bust into the room, Cyrus just says, there's no greater sinner than a man who hides an evil nature behind a uniform. And so in looking at these guys, he just says, come on then, right? Do what you're paid to do. Whatever happens, it's almost done. So like he goes to work on these guys, right? Getting to work on these dudes with handcuffs and a pipe. You can only imagine what happens next. And so at that point, you switch over to the fundraiser, right? And there's a kind of commotion going on here where the person running the fundraiser is trying to figure out where Bruce Wayne is, and he's not answering anybody's calls and that kind of thing. But then Penguin shows up here, right? And where he initially offers himself as a person to make the speech, right? As kind of the main star of it all, that initially he's rebuked. right? But he says, I was not asking permission, my dear. Your little hospital is on my turf. Be a good girl and find me a microphone. Now, at that point, you switch back over to Mercer, and Mercer is taking these guys apart. But the cool thing is we get this play-by-play on how his mind works in the midst of a fight. He says, do not let your muscles rush you, Alvin. Don't rush them. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast. It's the lesson that he gave to his son, right? And he says, don't tell your muscles what to do. They already know what to do. You already taught them what to do. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. And he just starts taking these guys apart bit by bit. He breaks one of the guy's arms, and then at that point pulls a gun on him and just says, that tall one sleeping over there, get me his uniform. You and I are going to walk out of this place like old friends. And where this guy begs, right? He's like, just please don't kill me. I can give you Scarface. The response of Mercer is he says, I already heard you say where Wesker's going. You do as you're told and walk me out of here, and you will sleep in your own bed tonight and never see me again. But you double-cross me, and I swear, this gun will be used to send you to meet your maker, which it most will assuredly do. And so when that happens, you jump back over to Batman and Bruce, right? That they arrive at the fundraiser trying to get a lay of the land, because it's a very, very chaotic place, as you could probably imagine. It's held outdoors, there's a lot of lights, there's a lot of noise, a lot of hustle and bustle, people moving around, right, shaking hands, and so on and so forth, because finding Wesker is not going to be any easy task, right? And so once they arrive here, Damian even says, there must be 3,000 people down there. How will we find Wesker in all of this? And that's where Batman just says, he will not be in the crowd. And he says, look past the crowds and search the shadows, the periphery. That's where we will find him, waiting in the dark. Somewhere he can hear Scarface's voice goading him on. It is crucial we take him down before Penguin's people know he's there. One maniac with a gun is a problem. If there's a crossfire, it'll be the warehouse massacre all over again. And so in that moment, you pick up with the Penguin's speech, right? And he says, Gotham loves a comeback story, doesn't it, right? Sacred Heart Convalescent Home was a relic, an itinerant ghost of a brighter bygone time, a warning to the young not to dream too big or reach too high, but ghosts get a second chance in Oswald Cobblepot's Gotham. My new Sacred Heart Medical Center is proof that if you want it badly enough, anything is possible. But that's the irony of all this, is because where Damian initially sees it as, Oswald Cobblepot stroking his own ego and taking credit for the hospital that's basically been set up by Bruce and Damian, right, for the city of Gotham, Batman tells him to look at the bigger picture, and he says he's put himself right in Scarface's crosshairs. Scarface will not hesitate to fire into this crowd. And Damian says, Father, we cannot fail tonight. Dr. Bashar died to bring grandfather's hospital back to life. If we let any of these people die, but that's where Batman cuts him off and says, we cannot always save everyone, but no one is dying on our watch tonight. And that's when he overhears the police scanner and realizes the quiet man is broken out of Blackgate. So he tells Damian, look for someone in a police uniform. But as you can probably imagine, Scarface is smart enough to at least come with something else up his sleeve. And so in that moment, as they're racing through all of this, Batman says, right, this is taking way too long. If Scarface or Quiet Man gets into the crowd, we're going to need a distraction. And that's when he notices fireworks, right? A visual distraction. But at the same time, Damian says exactly that. I see them, right? I've got a visual. 2 o'clock, Wesker, 2 shooters. And Batman just says, do not let them reach the crowd. I will handle the rest. And so Batman initiates the blackout sequence. And that's where we get this really cool monologue from Bruce, where he says, time slows to a crawl. When Penguin's men see the threat, they will start shooting. The crowd will panic. People will be trampled. And he says, not only must we disarm the shooters, no one can see or hear us doing it, which they successfully do. They start taking out each and every one of these guys. While Robin's dealing with some of these guys, Scarface takes off, right? Wesker goes running, and Robin's not far behind him. The crazy thing is that once he catches up to Scarface, who's basically down, right? He kind of trips him and knocks him over. Batman tells Robin, right? Like, stay with him and keep up your guard, because the Quiet Man could still be around here somewhere. And Cyrus walks up behind Damian and says, I am real sorry about this, son, but you should have kept your guard up. And just clocks Robin from behind, and then in turn starts addressing Scarface and says, Alvin Mercer, I want my boy's name to be the last sound you hear. And he goes to say Alvin, but in that moment, Damian calls out to Cyrus and says, don't do this, right? And he addresses him directly. He says, I read your letters to your son. The thing that happened to you two, a night like that also happened to Batman. He spends his life chasing it. Someday he will die chasing it. Everyone who loves him knows this. He simply is what he is forever. And Gotham is his place. Gotham is not your place yet. But if you kill Wesker, it will be. Wesker tried to use you to escape, but you stopped him. He will go back to Arkham. Let that be enough. And so Cyrus initially goes to blow this man's head apart with a 12-gauge shotgun, right? But ultimately lets him go and just looks back at Damian and just says, maybe you ought to be the one in charge. But in that moment, Scarface goes to grab a gun and goes to fire off at Wesker and hits him a couple times. Now, of course, Batman jumps in, takes out Scarface, and just says, I wanted too much to believe that you were gone, Scarface. I will not make that mistake again. But in the midst of this, Damian calls out to Batman because Cyrus is hit, and literally Damian is trying to bring him back. He's trying to make sure this guy stays alive, right? That he doesn't die. And so Batman asks, are there exit wounds? And Damian says, yes, but the lung is collapsed. I need to get a valve into the chest cavity so the trapped air and fluid can drain. And so Batman just asks, what do you need? And Damian says, I need him to not bleed to death while I get his lung working. Stuff fabric into the exit wounds and keep pressure on the others. Do not worry about infection. We can treat that later. Just keep his blood on the inside. What's crazy about this is that while all this goes down, everyone is distracted by the fireworks. No one knows what's happening. That's kind of the beauty of this entire moment with Quiet Man and with Scarface and all these guys, is the gunshots are muffled by the fireworks and it's all happening in the shadows. No one sees it taking place. Because truth to tell, if somebody happened to look back and see that Scarface was there and was shooting, then they would just panic. They would freak out, and it would lead to mass hysteria, people getting trampled to death, the one thing that he was trying to avoid. And so that's when you switch over to the aftermath of all of this. And of course, Bruce Wayne was listening to the police scanner, as he does, and he says the Quiet Man escaped police custody again. Impressive in his condition. I suppose that we'll have to hunt him down. And Bruce says, but he did take 2 bullets for you tonight, so he's earned his head start. If he makes it across the river, I do not expect that we will see him again. I hope he's able to find some kind of closure someday. But that's where Damian starts talking to himself, and he says, if he makes it across the river, right? If he makes it. And that's an important thing, because keep in mind, the whole hitch to all of this is the silver, right? The silver and the money in the original heist that led to Cyrus Mercer's son's death. One of Falcone's guys took the truck and raced off. And so that's where Damian says, Alvin Mercer shot and killed in his father's truck the night of the warehouse massacre. The body was never recovered. Falcone and the other mobs looked for the truck and Michael Brazzi, the driver, for years. Brazzi's children, siblings, girlfriends, none of them ever saw him again. And the missing silver never appeared on the black market. What if Brazzi never made it across the river? The wrecked Scarface car on the Tri-Gate Bridge suggested Brazzi won the shootout and got away. Presumably, he continued west, going off grid with the money and Mercer's doomed silver. But the Tri-Gate Bridge was under construction at that time. The 2 rightmost lanes of the westbound bridge were closed off and unlit. Skid marks indicate that Scarface's men swerved into traffic from the closed lanes where traffic wouldn't have seen them and where guardrails would have been flimsy and temporary. The shootout could have sent the 2 vehicles past the barriers into the closed, unlit lanes of the bridge. The Scarface car would have veered back into traffic, and Mercer's truck would have gone off the bridge. Brazzi was a loyal Falcone soldier from the beginning. He had plenty of chances to betray Falcone in the past, but never did. Brazzi did not steal Falcone's money. He died for it, and so did Alvin Mercer, because the truck with the silver is found at the bottom of the river. And so that's when you find that Mercer has basically gone back and is just kind of looking at this funeral that's taking place there and just kind of escaped the city of Gotham, right? Going off and doing his own thing. Who knows if he's ever going to come back? At that point, you pick up with kind of like Damian talking about his adventures, and you end up finding out from him when he says, Batman and Robin have a moment to breathe, and I am learning what it is to be a Wayne of Gotham. We have little time for movies or ball games or the kinds of things other families do, but we do make time together. Father is ill-suited to the more tedious duties at Sacred Heart, but he knows their importance and does not complain. The silver we recovered from the river is paying for a new pediatric center. Father says it is becoming a better hospital than it was in Grandfather's day. That would have pleased Dr. Bashar very much, Grandfather, I hope. And I hope Alvin Mercer would have approved of what became of the treasure that he died for. And he says, I feel my life and purpose coming into focus. A life and purpose I chose for myself, not a legacy I was born into or a mission forced upon me by others. Gotham is still the mission, but at least for now, it is also my home. The home where my father was born and his father, and where Batman and Robin were born also. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.